All right, welcome to our next module. This is Age and Acquisition and Characteristics and Common Strategies of ELLs. All right, so just as an overview, we're going to be talking about how age affects, plays a part in language acquisition, as well as the critical period hypothesis. We're going to talk about the U-curve hypothesis, the 5 stages of second language acquisition, various strategies, and influencing factors in second language acquisition. So, first, let's go ahead and talk about the role of age. Now, age is very important. We have, the idea of the critical period hypothesis is that there is at a young age is the best time to learn your L1. And when you think about it, that's when you're absorbing everything that's around you. Even in the womb, we hear language. And so, that all plays a part. We have a link for the story of Jeannie. If you're not familiar with that, please watch the YouTube video. It's very powerful. Jeannie's story is, that she was deprived of any social interaction as she was growing up, and how that affected her. And really, it takes a critical look at the critical period hypothesis. So please check that out. So just going back to the role of age, studies have shown that there is a critical period for your L1, and that would also include a second language. Now, that doesn't mean that a second language can't be learned before the age of 12. But in terms of it being a little bit more fluid, a little bit easier, then the younger a child is, the easier they will develop that second language. There's also a need for socialization and exposure to a language. So, it's more than just classroom. It's about seeing the language outside of an academic area. All right, so we have the U-curve hypothesis. And this ties into what we talked about during the module from last week. First, we have that honeymoon period. This would also be during that silent period where the learner is just taking everything in during their time where they are being exposed to the language, really the culture, everything. It's just they're in that honeymoon period where everything's good. Then we start to move into hostility. This is where they're starting to experiment with the language, and the learner this would be the time where they're struggling, really trying to get a grasp. But that L2 is it's not quite there yet. So there's a lot of uphill to getting communication through. With number 3, we start to see things start to turn on the up. This is where language is becoming a little bit more accessible to the learner. They're able to communicate. They're able to, kind of see that they're making progress, and mistakes are made, but it can all be taken in stride. And then 4, you have home, and this is where we have fluency, and their L2 is proficient as their L1. Okay. All right, so the 5 stages of second language acquisition. We have that silent stage, and that's where they're just receptive. They're just listening. And it's, from an educator standpoint, it's really important to be cognizant of that silent stage. And that silent stage isn't the same for everyone. Some students will have a very small silent window, and some may take quite a while before they feel comfortable in starting to imitate sounds that they hear and start to develop an understanding of the language. From there, we have the early production. So this would be using common phrases to start to communicate, but this can also still be, this is a transition from the silence. Speech emergence would be where we start to see series of words being put together, phrases, but we're far from complete sentences. We're starting to just see the basic understanding of language. Intermediate fluency would be, being able to communicate, but maybe missing several just, grammatical errors, things like that. That's where we would see this intermediate fluency, and then finally advanced language fluency, where they are speaking not necessarily as a native speaker, but as a, we're comfortable using an L2. All right, so here are some common communication strategies. Here is avoidance strategies. So lexical avoidance would be when the speaker is avoiding problematic words because they just don't know the words, so working their way around it. So we have the example, I lost my road. So maybe not knowing how to say, I lost my way, or I'm lost driving, it would be, what words do they know? I lost my road. So, just kind of working around a word that they don't know by coming up with a path of words that they do know. The next one is phonological avoidance. So avoiding words or phrases because the speaker is unsure about the way that the word is pronounced. A good example of this would be, speakers not using the word sheet, instead using the word blanket because they're afraid of the way that they pronounce the word sheet, and I'll let you make your own assumptions. Number 3, topical avoidance. So this is a lot like lexical avoidance, except they'd be, not avoiding an entire subject because they don't understand the word or the concept. For me, I think about this in terms of science terms, which are especially difficult for a lot of our ELL learners because it's so vocabulary centered. So you'll have science terms that maybe the student is unsure of, and so they'll avoid a whole topic about it because of not understanding pronunciation. So let's go ahead. So when students are compensating for these language deficits, these are some of the classic strategies that we might see. The first one is circumlocution, which is a word that I had to practice several times, which is describing or exemplifying something. So, say the speaker is trying to describe a wallet, so they might talk about the thing I keep money in, and I put it in my pocket and I carry it with me. So, not understanding maybe the key term wallet, but understanding words that they can use to describe it, which is a good thing because it shows that they are learning and being able to synthesize vocabulary that they know to describe something that they don't know the word for. Another one is approximation. So, using the word ship instead of canoe, also a positive thing because it means that they are understanding the concept. So we as educators need to step in then at that point and talk to the student or the language learner about what are the differences between a ship and a canoe. So being able to differentiate those things. The next one would be a new word coinage. So when the learner is inventing words to describe things that they don't know the vocabulary word for. So we have airball would be like a balloon, or house hat for a roof. The next one is code switching. So that'd be replacing a native word for an unknown target word. So, using your L1 to fill in the gaps of where, a term or it makes me think of nouns. If you don't know the word for a certain noun, then you would just go ahead and replace it with your L1. The next one is the yes man. So I see this quite a bit, especially with really newcomer students who are in my classroom, as well as just basically very naive to their L2 students. And this is just answering yes and demonstrating a comprehension, which is something you really got to look at and look for in a classroom, because you will have these sweet students, and you'll ask them something and they go, yep, uh-huh, and they don't know, and they're doing this as a coping mechanism because they know if they say yes, things keep moving, or maybe that they won't be asked, or that things won't be repeated to them, you know. So it's, I think that I've probably been guilty of doing this in my L1 as well. So these are some of the compensating strategies for this. Influencing factors of second language acquisition. One thing that we really need to look at is learner attitude and motivation, and how that can affect acquisition for our language learners. So learner attitude, it is, you know, we want the student to have a positive attitude about, you know, getting into and learning another language. If we need to make sure that it can be modified, that we have differentiation, that we can change things to help, that we're persistent, and that they are, we also want to make sure that with a positive attitude, and they are learning through this experience, okay? And so if the attitude is negative, we're not going to be seeing these things, and that's going to definitely have a negative effect on our second language acquisition for our students. The next is motivation. You know, we want to try to make sure that the student or learner is interested in the tasks, making it desirable for that learner to take on a very big task, which is to learn another language. That we are looking at, you know, scaffolding and looking at skill levels, and, you know, pushing students just a little bit, you know, making sure that it's just out of their reach so that they have to work towards it. Also that intrinsic versus extrinsic. So, you know, making motivation is that something that where you're wanting to, ideally you want the student to want to learn, and you want to have that integrated into their learning, you know, that desire to learn the next new thing. And also extrinsic, you know, how are we meeting that goal for them? What are they wanting to do with this language? And making sure that we're letting them know that they are getting closer to that task. This slide is interesting in that it's talking about the different writers' perspectives on motivation, and so we just see, you know, how it's broken down. All right, so with our strategies, we have metacognitive, cognitive, and social affective. And we're going to look at this from a teacher standpoint as well as a student standpoint, because the learner also is involved in the learning process. Metacognitive really talks about, you know, thinking about what we're going to be learning, okay, and thinking about the process of learning. So from a teacher standpoint, you know, we need to be organized and prepared. You know, this all needs to happen in advance. This is, while the learning process is organic, it involves more preparation for language learning. For the students' standpoint, they also need to be prepared and organized to be effective learners. Organizational planning involving, you know, how are we going to approach language, depending on where your students are at, whether or not we need to start at a very basic level or we can work a little bit further up, but just having a plan in place. Selective attention, talking about, you know, how are we going to break up groups, you know, how are we going to give attention to certain students, or from the student standpoint, you know, what areas of learning do they really need to focus on and think about focusing on during the process. So self-evaluation, obviously from the learner standpoint, they need to evaluate their abilities to learn as well as their successes in learning. From a teacher standpoint, we need to look at how are we teaching, you know, is it working, is it not working, and to if it's not, then going back and thinking about how we can change some of these items from above, or organization, preparation, and planning. So moving on to cognitive strategies. With cognitive strategies, we're looking at, what do we want them to be good at? What are we trying to get them to do to become effective learners? So that first one is contextualization. As educators, we always need to be contextualizing everything. Explanations on vocabulary, putting things in perspective. From a learner standpoint, we need to teach our students how to elaborate. We as teachers elaborate all the time. We're always talking, but that's a skill set that we need to get our students to also do, is to be able to describe and go further with their ideas. Looking at grouping, how from an educator standpoint, we want to think about, what ways can we effectively group students together or group ideas together to be effective. From a learner standpoint, we want the learner to be able to group things together, concepts and terms. We always want to use imagery whenever you can. Visual tools are great for helping bridge gaps for our students, and it helps reference ideas. Inferencing, we want our students to be able to ask questions and to be able to dig deeper. And then we have more technical things like the ability for note-taking. That's something we definitely want our students to be able to do, to be able to grow in. These are all tools to becoming an independent learner. And finally, summarizing, being able to take all these concepts and put them all together to make a total idea. Finally, we have the social effective strategies. This is really looking at, how do we get, we've given them all these ideas, we've given them all these tools, so how can they take what they know, and what they've learned, and put it into use? So, two ways we can look at this. The first one is cooperation, and getting students out of the shell, and getting that interaction, that social aspect of language learning, which is huge, not only with fellow ELL students, but also with the mainstream class, getting that cooperation in and building stronger language skills through socialization and cooperation. The next one is questioning for clarification. We want our students to be comfortable questioning and asking questions about language. If a student has a question over a term or something phonetic, and they're not comfortable asking those questions to clarify, we don't know what they don't know. So this is all these strategies, they tie into each other. The metacognitive and cognitive definitely have our end goal is to get the social strategy together to make the student an independent learner and to build those language skills.